bars and restaurants. A 10 p.m. curfew from Thursday. I can hear more engines starting, perhaps PM's about to leave. We also heard from Michael Gove this morning that there would also be changing, a development in the work from home advice, and that advice is now, if you can work from home in England, you should. Following, as the Welsh Government pointed out, their own advice. It would be interesting to hear from the Prime Minister, firstly, his tone. You know, Boris Johnson likes to be positive, he likes to be optimistic. Will he be able to display that sort of optimism when, as you say, Adam, the government and the country is sort of going back in our response to COVID-19? It'd be also interesting to look for clues as to what happens next, what the government's plan is if the measures he announces today do not work. Is there effectively a backup plan? Is there an alternative? And of course, people will be looking ahead to Christmas in that sense, and also to understand what will be happening with all four nations. Today, the Prime Minister started his day with a cabinet meeting at 8:30 to rubber stamp what he wants to do, the decisions that he and his top team have made. Second on the agenda was that COBRA meeting, that's the government's emergency committee, and that when he was trying to get the First Ministers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, of course, on side with his announcement, because of course he's keen to have a four nations approach, for clarity, to have everybody on the same page. There has been criticism that people don't understand the complexities of the rules, especially with so many smaller local lockdowns in different regions of the different nations. So perhaps in this current COBRA meeting, he'll be trying to get Nicola Sturgeon, Mark Drakeford, Arnie Foster and Michelle O'Neill on side as well. That meeting, we don't know if it's still going on. It could be. If it is, it's been going on for a very long time. We last saw the Prime Minister leave the Foreign Office crossing this road to get into Downing Street at 9:15, so nearly 3 hours ago. We know there has been criticism, including from the Prime Minister's own party, not just on grounds of the economic impact of measures. Of course, many, including the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, are focusing on the economic recovery, but also on principles of liberty and freedom. A lot of Conservative backbenchers do not like the idea of all of us being told what we can or cannot do. So to recap, the first big change in England is this 10 p.m. curfew in pubs, bars and restaurants. That will come into place from Thursday. We think that's really focused on younger people. We know from yesterday's slides it's 20 to 29-year-olds where rates of the virus are highest, and perhaps with putting in a 10 p.m. curfew, they will be out drinking. They will not be out drinking later. Therefore, perhaps less chances of them failing to socially distance and the virus passing on. The big new restriction announced by Michael Gove this morning was on work from home. Just 17 days ago, the government were pushing for civil servants to get back to the office, for Whitehall to set the example for the rest of the country. And there was a target by the end of this month that 80% of civil servants here in Whitehall to be in the office. That now, Mr Gove confirmed this morning, has been completely abandoned, and with it, this effort to get people who can go back to the office to go back to the office. Now, thinking behind that was it should have been part of the economic recovery. It was important to support small businesses that support offices like, for example, sandwich shops, to support public transport providers. Let's be clear that has now been completely abandoned. Michael Gove said that it was just a shift in emphasis. Let's be honest, it was far more than that. Critics of the government might even call it a U-turn. We're hoping to hear, Adam, from the Prime Minister at 12:30. He should be out of this door very soon. All eyes on it, though, so far to see if he's about to leave. These engines have been on for quite some time.
my lens, don't worry. I'm not that excited about getting a picture of Boris.
I think Canon should be the word actually, right?
I don't know why I'm so high up. You feel like it makes me feel superior to them. Exactly. I always try to calm yeah, okay. Compensation.
That's
$50 grand a year.
straight.
Running over it then.
The previous Chancellor, Javid and his family. Number 11 has 4 bedrooms, and number 10 has 2 bedrooms. He moved Javid's family to the 2 bedroom, number 10 now, and he, Boris, to number 11, 4 bedrooms.
You have 3 bedrooms with different mistresses.
Yeah, he's complaining as they say some of these kids are not 18, as they say
Maybe that's why he wants to leave, but he can just get on the afternoon of speaking.
He lost his $170 grand column.
Get that back as well.
Yeah, that's right.
He's surprised at 6 feet.
Yeah, they've got chicken beef because they don't have a
chicken
cooking, do they? It's like fucking takeout. Move on takeout.
Can't get him in.
No, I don't think so. We'll find out.
Morning, Boris. Is your strategy failing, Prime Minister?
Let's go!
How is that for Kinder?
Oh, I think the pool.
You're done for the time being.
Yeah, the pool's finished. I'm not doing testing runs and things.
I thought a line
yeah. Yeah, we should be sorry, I know we're on the pool.
Yeah. No, we're doing it at 1:30. So.
Oh, you're doing it. I mean, social distancing is a thing that Pat's done, really. What? That was the thing, like, oh yeah, they're all going to be nice and spaced, and that's for one snapper, that's for another one there. I've not been there in ages, so I'm going to keep the mask on for that.
I think one structure is all about present.
Really?
There's down here.
No.
Channel 4 gun lamp.
That's a nice spot. The weather's good. It's a nice spot. You get a really nice view of it.
And you're out of the way.
And we're good to go?
You know who's doing festival stuff?
Yes, Ramsey. Ramsey Beige.
Leave the room out.
Yeah. Probably 3 of them.
Do you know how much money was paid for unused material for advocates? Not a penny piece. This is the government that is putting money into the profession. That's the way it's going to stay.
We come to topicals, Olivia Blake.
One.
Being safe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first duty of any government is to protect their people. Too often our system of sentencing in England and Wales doesn't command the public's confidence. So last week I laid a white paper entitled A Smarter Approach to Sentencing. The measures in the paper will keep serious, violent and sexual offenders in prison for longer and prevent the automatic release of prisoners before the end of their sentence if they present a danger to the public. But protecting the public from the effects of lower-level offending also means finding new ways to break cycles of crime. And our proposals for robust community sentences, backed by an empowered probation service and utilising the most up-to-date technology, will make the smart interventions to address the things that can drive low-level offending, such as poor mental health and drug and alcohol addiction. This smarter approach will grow confidence in our system of justice. A cross-government approach will characterise the reforms, but as we bring them before this House, I also look forward to support from across the political divide so that we can work together to keep the public safe from harm and to bring down stubbornly high rates of reoffending for good.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The prison operator G4S is withholding full sick pay from workers who operate in close contact with prisoners. Yeah. Does the Secretary of State agree with me and the GMB union that this is scandalous, and will he support calls for G4S to provide the sick pay its workers deserve?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for that question, and whilst it perhaps would be wrong of me to make direct comment about what is sadly a dispute, I will certainly look into the matter and report back to her as to the latest progress or otherwise in this matter. Can I say that I do hugely value prison staff and the incredible work that they've done, not just throughout the COVID pandemic, but beforehand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Magistrates have been dispensing justice in our communities for centuries, but in the last decade their numbers have over halved, not helped by the fact they have to retire at the age of 70, us losing therefore about 20 a week at a time when we have a record number of cases to get through those courts. So will my right honourable friend look carefully at the private members' bill that I have put forward to raise their age to 75, as well as act quickly off the back of the government's own consultation on this issue?
Well, I pay tribute to my honourable friend for the work he is doing on this important issue and for the introduction of his bill, and I fully recognise his concern. That's why we're working with the judiciary on a programme to increase the overall number of recruited magistrates, and we are consulting on proposals to increase the mandatory retirement age of judicial office holders, including magistrates. That consultation closes on the 16th of October, and I will consider the matter very carefully before reaching a final decision.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware that in recent years there's been increased understanding of neurodivergent people and the issues that this presents in the criminal justice system. Yet there are still neurodivergent individuals who face disproportionate prison sentences, and in the case of foreign national offenders, could risk deportation to a country where they have no support. Will he commit to immediately reviewing all cases of neurodivergent individuals, and particularly those who face imminent deportation?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady. She raises an issue that she will probably know is very close to my heart. And in the White Paper, we've announced a call for evidence about neurodivergence within the criminal justice system, because I think that we can do much, much better, not just in terms of understanding and making adjustments for people with autism and other conditions when they get into the system, but preventing them from getting into the system in the first place. One of the issues I think she raises is, of course, the question of diagnosis. And many people are not even diagnosed, even though they present with these problems. I will look at that matter more closely, and I'm grateful to her for raising it.
Community sentencing must contain a punitive element, most likely unpaid hours. Rather than an offender working in a charity shop or such like, what are my right honourable friend's plans for ensuring offenders really do pay their debt to society by, for example, saving money for local communities and taxpayers by litter picking and so on?
Well, my honourable friend is right to raise the important issue of unpaid work, because it is a way for offenders to make reparation to wider society for the damage that is caused by crime. And as part of our White Paper plans, we will introduce a new statutory duty for important stakeholders such as police and crime commissioners to be consulted on the type of unpaid work projects in their area. That means that I believe that we will see projects being delivered that are far more at the heart of the communities in which they live.
We come to Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government intends to break an international treaty it negotiated while blaming the other party when it's going to act in good faith. Tomorrow the government brings forward a bill that seeks to decriminalise torture. Instead of global Britain, isn't this a further indication this government intends to act as a rogue state?
No.
Andrew Percy, that's easily dealt with.
Behind bars, the public should be protected from further criminal activity by those in prisons, but too often criminality continues. What use are we making of measures such as body scanners to ensure that criminals are not able to continue their behaviour behind bars?
Well, my honourable friend raises a very important point, and last year the government announced a £100 million boost to investment in the installation of body scanners in many of our prisons, particularly those Category B local prisons with a high number of receptions and visitors as well. It not only protects prisoners themselves from abuse, but it also protects staff too, and makes prisons, I believe, a safer place in which to work, and gives greater confidence in the wider public that we are doing everything we can to make our prisons as safe as possible.
Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been contacted by a local resident who works in a shop telling me about the increase in abuse that she's faced during COVID-19. And she said, and I quote, that she managed to get a full-time guard and body cameras, but still the abuse continues. Now, further to the question from my honourable friend for Harrow West, will the government support the trade unions and the British Retail Consortium in their call for tougher action for those who assault retail staff?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises a very disturbing case, and sadly it is not alone. Many shop workers have been at the front line of providing vital services through the intensity of the lockdown and continue to do so. I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that sentencing guidelines properly reflect the role that they play. There is helpful reference, of course, to people in that line of service in the sentencing guidelines, but if there is more that we can do to draw the court's attention to the particular importance of shop workers, then that is something that we should do.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The White Paper published last week by my Right Honourable Friend's Department proposes extending whole life orders to 18 to 20-year-olds in wholly exceptional cases, and I think that most people understand and agree with this, but there are many others in that age group who will be released, including those serving at Aylesbury YOI in my constituency. Will my right honourable friend ensure that young adults in custody can access programmes that are tailored to their specific age group and their particular needs in an effort to ensure that they do not commit crime again once freed?
Secretary Butler.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I pay tribute to the therapeutic services at Aylesbury YOI who I've met in the past. We've clearly stated that we see young adults right up to the age of 25 as a group that need treatment that is different to other cohorts, and we have specialist models for operation delivery to support prisons holding young adults to get the best results for this group. And the curriculum at Aylesbury includes personal and social development skills, business, horticulture, barbering and decorating, and we are going to reinforce that with our new National Prisoner Education Service that is focused on work-based training and skills.
Let's head to Manchester to Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. It's absolutely crucial that victims' rights are recognised and protected in their dealings with police, prosecutors and courts. Dame Vera Baird QC, the Victims Commissioner, has called on ministers to make good on promises to give crime victims enforceable rights in law. She's right, the code consultation was a good first step, but where's the victims' law up to?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for raising that important point, and I pay tribute to the work of the Victims Commissioner and indeed her predecessor. He will be glad to know that a wider consultation on the new revised Victims Code has been finished. We will be publishing the revised Victims Code in the next several weeks. It is a much smaller, user-friendly document, but further than that, we will legislate as soon as possible, within the next year, for a victims' law to enshrine the rights contained in the code and elsewhere to give the higher protection for victims that both he and I want to see.
We're heading to Bexley Heath with Sir David Evanet. Sir David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly welcome my right honourable friend's white paper, A Smarter Approach to Sentencing. However, could he advise what steps he's taking to improve the process of disclosure of criminal records?
Well, my right honourable friend is right to raise the important point of disclosure of criminal records. Why? Because in too many cases, it has been a bar to employment, which is a surefire way out of reoffending. So for the first time in our white paper, we set out revised rules, and some custodial sentences of over 4 years will be able to become spent as part of criminal records checks for non-sensitive roles, in addition to significant reductions to the rehabilitation periods for sentences under 4 years. And these proposals, alongside recently approved legislation to change the rules governing disclosure for sensitive roles by removing the multiple convictions rule and the disclosure of youth cautions, will indeed help those who have offended in the past now access employment.
We now head to Pontypridd with Alex Davies-Jones. Alex Davies-Jones.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. At a time where the public are confined more than usual to their homes, potential victims of domestic abuse are more vulnerable than ever. It is vital that the wheels of justice keep turning even in a pandemic. What steps are being taken to make sure that trials of people accused of domestic abuse are being prioritised?
Well, I can reassure the Honourable Lady that domestic abuse trials have continued to be prioritised throughout the pandemic, with early listings in Wales in particular, where I visited recently. I'm very impressed by the work that's been done to list cases in the Magistrates' Court to remove the backlog, and indeed in the Crown Court as well. Trials are being listed at the earliest opportunity. She can be assured that priority is given to domestic abuse cases when these matters are listed.
Mr. Speaker, will my right honourable friend agree with me that delays in the court system can actually be very damaging, if not traumatic, to all parties attending court? Can he assure me and this House that capacity across the Ministry and courts across the land is being increased to make sure that we catch up with the delays incurred by the COVID pandemic?
Secretary Butler.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I'd like to thank all our staff in HMCTS who have carried on working throughout this pandemic. Currently, over 70% of staff work from a court or tribunal building, and the rest are working at home via the cloud video platform. We've invested 142 million in our court system, or we are at the moment, to speed up those technological and modernisation improvements, and we're investing an additional 80 million to support the recovery of our criminal courts, including the recruitment of 1,600 members of staff and further adaptations to our courtrooms to allow more and more of them to be used.
Could the Secretary of State outline the legislation or case rulings which precludes Northern Ireland Bar registered barristers located on the mainland GP, such as Silk, Hugh Mercer of Essex Chambers in London, from claiming expenses for travel and hotel accommodation for Northern Ireland court cases? And does the Secretary of State believe constitutional integrity should allow any Silk to practice and be reimbursed?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. I must declare an interest because I am a member of the Northern Ireland Bar. The particular issue he raises seems to me to be a matter for the Northern Ireland Justice Authorities. However, I will discuss the matter with him further so that we can obtain maximum clarity.
Speaker, in Gedling, Nottinghamshire Police's Operation Reacher teams are knocking down many drug dealers' doors in Gedling. Can my right honourable friend tell me what steps the Ministry of Justice is taking to ensure that we punish those guilty dealers, to ensure that we keep our society safe?
Well, I pay tribute to that operation in Nottinghamshire and to many others that are safeguarding our communities. Parliament has indeed provided the courts with the full range of sentencing powers in order to deal effectively with these offenders, but tough enforcement is also a fundamental part of our approach, and we are taking a smarter approach to the restriction of drugs supply, using technology and data, and taking partnership action with other agencies to tackle drugs alongside other criminal activity.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Devon and Cornwall Police were an early adopter of the virtual court processes, but sustaining these new arrangements is taking up valuable police officer time. Could the Secretary of State confirm what steps the Department has taken to ensure these courts can continue to operate effectively during the outbreak so police forces can keep their officers on the streets?
Well, the work of Devon and Cornwall Police in making sure that virtual court processes carry on at this challenging time is very much appreciated. I am going to include in primary legislation, to be introduced as early as possible in 2021, provision to allow court-appointed contractors to staff those virtual courts within police custody suites in order to relieve the burden on serving police officers.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. Before the Prime Minister addresses the Chamber, could I just point out that British Sign Language interpretation of the statement is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. I now call the Prime Minister to make his statement. Prime Minister
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will make a statement on our response to the rising number of coronavirus cases and how we must act now to avoid still graver consequences later on. At every stage in this pandemic, we have struck a delicate balance between saving lives by protecting our NHS and minimising the wider impact of our restrictions. And it's because of the common sense fortitude of the British people that earlier this year we were able to avert an even worse catastrophe, forming a human shield around our NHS and then getting our country moving again by reopening key sectors of our economy, returning children to school. But we always knew that while we might have driven the virus into retreat, the prospect of a second wave was real. And I'm sorry to say that, as in Spain and France and many other countries, we've reached a perilous turning point. A month ago, on average, around 1,000 people across the UK were testing positive for coronavirus every day. The latest figure has almost quadrupled to 3,929. Yesterday, the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor warned that the doubling rate for new cases could be between 7 and 20 days, with the possibility of tens of thousands of new infections next month. I wish I could reassure the House that the growing number of cases is merely a function of more testing, but a rising proportion of the tests themselves are yielding a positive result. I also wish I could say that more of our people now have the antibodies to keep the virus off, but the latest data suggests that fewer than 8% of us are in this position. It's true that the number of new cases is growing fastest amongst those aged 20 to 29, but the evidence shows that the virus is spreading to other, more vulnerable age groups, as we have seen in France and Spain, where this has led to increased hospital admissions and, sadly, more deaths. In the last fortnight, daily hospital admissions in England have more than doubled. Tens of thousands of daily infections in October would, as night follows day, lead to hundreds of daily deaths in November, and those numbers would continue to grow unless we act. And as with all respiratory viruses, COVID is likely to spread faster as autumn becomes winter. Yesterday, on the advice of the 4 chief medical officers, the UK's COVID alert level was raised from 3 to 4, the second most serious stage, meaning that transmission is high or rising exponentially. So this is the moment when we must act. If we can curb the number of daily infections and reduce the reproduction rate to 1, then we can save lives, protect the NHS and the most vulnerable, and shelter the economy from the far sterner and more costly measures that would inevitably become necessary later on. So we're acting on the principle that a stitch in time saves 9. The government will introduce new restrictions in England, carefully judged to achieve the maximum reduction in the R number with the minimum damage to lives and livelihoods. I want to stress that this is by no means a return to the full lockdown of March. We're not issuing a general instruction to stay at home. We will ensure that schools, colleges and universities stay open, because nothing is more important than the education, health and well-being of our young people. We will ensure that businesses can stay open in a COVID-compliant way. However, we must take action to suppress the disease. First, we are once again asking office workers who can work from home to do so. In key public services and in all professions where home working is not possible, such as construction or retail, people should continue to attend their workplaces. And like government, this House will be free to take forward its business in a COVID-secure way, which you, Mr. Speaker, have pioneered. Second, From Thursday, all pubs, bars and restaurants must operate a table service only, Mr. Speaker, except for takeaways. Together with all hospitality venues, they must close at 10 p.m. And to help the police enforce this rule, I'm afraid that means, alas, closing and not just calling for last orders, because simplicity is paramount. The same will apply to takeaways, though deliveries can continue thereafter. And I'm sorry that this will affect many businesses just getting back on their feet, but we must act to stop the virus from being transmitted in bars and restaurants. Third, we will extend the requirement to wear face coverings to include staff in retail, all users of taxis and private hire vehicles, and staff and customers in indoor hospitality, except when seated at a table to eat or drink. Fourth, in retail, leisure and tourism and other sectors, our COVID-secure guidelines will become legal obligations. Businesses will be fined and could be closed if they breach the rules. Fifth, now is the time to tighten up the rule of 6. I'm afraid that from Monday, a maximum of 15 people will be able to attend wedding ceremonies and receptions, though up to 30 can still attend a funeral as now. We will also have to extend the rule of 6 to all adult indoor team sports. Finally, we have to acknowledge that the spread of the virus is now affecting our ability to reopen business conferences, exhibitions, and large sporting events. So we will not be able to do this from the 1st of October, and I recognise the implications for our sports clubs, which are the life and soul of our communities, and my right honourable friends, the Chancellor and Culture Secretary, are working urgently on what we can do now to support them. Mr. Speaker, these rules, these measures, will only work if people comply. And there is nothing more frustrating for the vast majority who do comply, the law-abiding majority, than the sight of a few brazenly defying the rules. So these rules will be enforced by tighter penalties. We've already introduced a fine of up to £10,000 for those who fail to safe isolate, and such fines will now be applied to businesses breaking COVID rules. The penalty for failing to wear a mask or breaking the rule of 6 will now double to £200 for a first offence. We will provide the police and local authorities with the extra funding they need, a greater police presence on our streets, and the option to draw on military support where required to free up the police. The measures I've announced all apply in England, and the devolved administrations are taking similar steps. I spoke yesterday with each of the First Ministers and again today, and I thank them for their collaboration. The health of everyone in these islands depends on our common success. Already, about 13 million people across England are living under various local restrictions over and above national measures. We will continue to act against local flare-ups, working alongside councils and strengthening measures where necessary. And I want to speak directly to those who were shielding early in the pandemic and who may be anxious about being at greater risk. Following advice from our senior clinicians, our guidance continues to be that you do not need to shield except in local lockdown areas, and we will keep this under constant review. I must emphasise that if all our actions fail to bring the R below 1, then we reserve the right to deploy greater firepower with significantly greater restrictions. I fervently want to avoid taking this step, as do the devolved administrations, but we will only be able to avoid it if our new measures work and our behaviour changes. Mr. Speaker, we will spare no effort in developing vaccines, treatments, new forms of mass testing, but unless we palpably make progress, we should assume that the restrictions I have announced will remain in place for perhaps 6 months. For the time being, this virus is a fact of our lives, and I must tell the House and the country that our fight against it will continue. We will not listen to those who say let the virus rip, nor to those who urge a permanent lockdown. We are taking decisive and appropriate steps to balance saving lives with protecting jobs and livelihoods. I know all of this will have profound consequences for our constituents. So the government will give the House every opportunity to scrutinise our decisions. In addition to regular statements and debates, honourable members will be able to question the government's scientific advisers more regularly, gain access to data about their constituencies, your constituencies, and join daily calls with my right honourable friend, the Paymaster General. After 6 months of restrictions, it would be tempting to hope that the threat has faded and to seek comfort in the belief that if you have avoided the virus so far, then you are somehow immune. I have to say that it is that kind of complacency that could be our undoing. If we fail to act together now, we will not only place others at risk, but jeopardise our own futures with the more drastic action that we would inevitably be forced to take. Mr. Speaker, no British government would wish to stifle our freedoms in the ways that we have found necessary this year. Yet even now we can draw some comfort, from the fact that schools and universities and places of worship are staying open. Shops can serve their customers. Construction workers can go to building sites, and the vast majority of the UK economy can continue moving forwards. We are also, Mr. Speaker, better prepared for a second wave, with the ventilators, the PPE, the dexamethasone, the Nightingale hospitals, and 100 times as much testing as we began this epidemic with. So it now falls to each of us and every one of us to remember the basics. Wash our hands, cover our faces, observe social distancing, and follow the rules. Then we can fight back against this virus, shelter our economy from even greater damage, protect the most vulnerable in care homes and hospitals, safeguard our NHS, and save many more lives. And I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and for his telephone call last night. Mr. Speaker, the picture presented yesterday by the government's advisers was stark and cannot be ignored. Infections are rising, hospitalisations are rising, the trajectory is clear, and we know from bitter experience what happens next. So it is right that the Prime Minister is announcing further measures today, and we support those measures, just as we supported lockdown in March and the more recent local lockdowns. Although we fierce criticism of the way the government is handling this pandemic, when restrictions are needed, the national interest lies in clear communications and cross-party support. And so we will, as we've done before, encourage people to follow the government guidance and obey the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, families across the country will be anxious today. Many are already living under local lockdowns. Many more fear that soon they will. They're worried about their jobs, about their loved ones, and whether they will be able to spend Christmas with their families. They will also be worried that the government doesn't have a clear strategy. One day people are encouraged to work in the office. In fact, more than encouraged, they were openly challenged by the Prime Minister for not doing so. Today, they're told the opposite. This is a time of national crisis, and we need clear leadership. So it's right the Prime Minister answer a number of serious questions about the next steps. First, a number of areas in England already have localised restrictions, including some that are very similar to those announced today. Pubs and restaurants in Bolton, for example, have been told to shut at 10 p.m. for about 2 weeks. Leicester's been in localised restrictions for about 3 months, and yet the infections in those areas remain high. So can the Prime Minister be sure that the restrictions he's introducing today will be effective at suppressing the virus? And if they don't work, when does he envisage further measures might be necessary? I also want to ask about the support for families and businesses. These restrictions will put further pressures on the hospitality sector, on high streets and town centres, on people's jobs and businesses. So what emergency financial support will be made available to those that need it? There was nothing in the Prime Minister's statement about that. There's a big gap here. And will he now accept that withdrawing the furlough scheme in one fell swoop would be a disaster, and actually at complete odds with the measures he's just announced for possibly up to 6 months? And will he take us up on our offer to work with him and trade unions and businesses on a replacement scheme that protects jobs and businesses? Mr. Speaker, given the rise in infections we're seeing, these restrictions are necessary, but they were not inevitable. We warned the Prime Minister months ago that testing need to be fixed by the autumn. The Academy of Medical Sciences told him the same in July. They said testing and tracing capacity will need to be significantly expanded to cope with the increased demands over the winter. But the government didn't listen. They pretended there wasn't a problem. They didn't act quickly enough. Now the testing system isn't working just when we need it. We should also recognise that a second national lockdown is not inevitable. That would be a huge failure of government, not an act of God. There is still time to prevent it. That must be a national effort. Labour will do whatever is reasonable and necessary to support that, to save lives, to protect the NHS. But the government must lead, and they must do so fast.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his support. Though I notice that it seems to come and go, but it seems to be here today. He criticises testing. He should know, Mr. Speaker, that as I've told the House many times, this country is now testing more than any other country in Europe. One test for every 5 people, and actually, in spite of the massive increase in the demand for testing, we have greatly increased the number of contacts that are being reached from the index cases, and I think he should pay tribute to those who are involved in the whole testing operation, in spite of all the difficulties that they face. He mentions the success of local lockdowns, and he's absolutely right to draw attention to what happened in Leicester, and that was a heroic effort of local people, and it's happened in other parts of the country, local people pulling together to drive the virus down. That is what we hope to encourage throughout the country, and that is certainly part of our strategy. He asked, Mr. Speaker, about what we're doing to support business, to support families and to support communities across the country, as though we hadn't already, quite rightly, spent £160 billion, Mr. Speaker, to support business and jobs across the country, jobs and livelihoods, and we will continue to put our arms around the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful, as I say, for what he has said, for the support such as it is that he has offered. But what I can tell him is that in putting forward the message of support, I hope he will also say to everybody in his constituency and elsewhere that this is a balanced and a proportionate response to the crisis that we face. We are driving the virus down. That is our objective by these measures, but we are also, as I said, Mr. Speaker, keeping the vast majority of the UK economy going. That is our programme. That is what we intend to do. This is a package. This is a package to drive down the R, but also to allow education and jobs and the growth to continue. And that is absolutely vital for the right honourable gentleman to understand. And I hope in his support, which I welcome, he will communicate that to the country as well.
Let's head to Amersham with Dame Cheryl Gillen. Dame Cheryl Gillen.
One of the most difficult decisions a Prime Minister has to take in a democracy is to restrict our freedoms for the greater good. And in the measures he's announced today and the cross-party consensus, I think my right honourable friend has sought balance and proportionality, as he says, protecting the economy whilst reducing the risk of the virus spreading like a wildfire. But with this 6-month timeframe he's announced, what does he say to grandparents who want to live their lives before it's too late and cannot see their families, to worried parents and families who cannot access a test at the moment, to workers and business owners facing financial ruin, and to MPs that want to debate these matters in Parliament before they are decided, not after, so they can help him shoulder this onerous responsibility? How can he convince all of them that he's taking the right path? and unite our country with hope of an end to this misery.
I thank my right honourable friend, and she's entirely right that Parliament should and will debate these issues, and Mr. Speaker, we will make time early next week in government time for a full debate on these measures.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. Mr. Speaker, we have reached a critical moment. The virus has not gone away. It's not going away, and it remains as deadly as ever. I welcome the fact that, following calls this weekend from our First Minister, a four-nation Cobra meeting has taken place this morning. We have all witnessed the worrying rise in virus cases over the last number of weeks, and we all know that the projections and consequences our society will face if it continues to grow at the same rate. But we must also be clear about one thing. If we take the right actions now, there is nothing inevitable about the exponential spread of this virus. If we act decisively, if we move sharply, if we take the right tough decisions now, we can get the virus back under control. We can minimise the time we all spend under new restrictions, and most importantly, we can save lives. Mr. Speaker, today governments across the four nations are rightly asking citizens to make more sacrifices to protect our collective health. In return for these sacrifices, it is only right that citizens are provided with financial support amid the health and economic uncertainty. Mr. Speaker, we are now just a few short weeks away from the end of the furlough scheme. Analysis from the Scottish Government has already shown that extending the scheme by 8 months could save around 61,000 jobs in Scotland. France, Germany and Ireland have already extended their job retention schemes into next year. But the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have rigidly refused to extend furlough. But we all know that U-turns and mixed messaging have come to define this government. And the 10th of July, the Prime Minister said, go back to work if you can. On the 14th of August, the Chancellor said it was crucial that we do our bit, such as going back to our place of work. And on the 27th of August, government sources said, go back to work or risk losing your job. The Prime Minister has changed his advice this morning on working from home. It is now time to change his mind on furlough as well. So today I have one question, and it's a question that 61,000 employees in Scotland are asking. Prime Minister, they deserve certainty and they deserve an answer. Will this government now save these jobs and extend the furlough scheme beyond October? Prime Minister, do not throw workers on the scrap heap through no fault of their own.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there was a great deal in the right honourable gentleman's question that I agreed with, and I think he's right that we need to take decisive action now, and I'm very grateful for the collaboration that we've all been engaging across the UK. Our objective, Mr. Speaker, is to keep businesses going and to keep the economy moving as much as we can. And indeed to allow people to go back to work where they must, but of course to work from home if they can. It's very, very clear what the choices are and what the guidance is. And of course, we will continue to support businesses. We will continue to support people who face challenges because of coronavirus throughout our United Kingdom. And I would remind him that in Scotland alone, the Barnett consequentials of the support, I think, are now well over £5 billion, and across the whole of the UK, in the devolved administrations, about £12.6 billion. And we will continue to send that support throughout the whole of the UK, to put our arms around the whole of the workforce of the UK, and to protect jobs and livelihoods. But what we also want to see is those businesses continuing and jobs being created.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the measures announced today. The Prime Minister will have decided them with a heavy heart, but all the evidence from South Korea, Singapore and other countries is that early, decisive action now is the best way to avoid a second full lockdown later. I want to ask him about testing. We have tripled capacity since May and will double it again by the end of October. So there has been a transformation, but we're not there yet. How can he reassure a school in my constituency which has a child who is tested positive but they only get a quota of 10 tests every 3 weeks. And they are worried that they may have people who are passing on the virus asymptomatically that they're not able to identify. What would he say to them and to schools up and down the country that are trying so hard to do the right thing?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right that we are and have massively increased testing across the country. We're now prioritising teachers, as he knows. He raises a very important point about school pupils, and there is a very interesting fact, which is that actually the rates of infection and transmission amongst school pupils are much lower than in the rest of the population. But I'm not going to hide it from him that the future I see for our country and the way to defeat this virus is massively to expand testing, and not just for teachers, and not just for in schools, but throughout the country. And that is why I'm proud that NHS Test and Trace, in spite of all the difficulties which the Right Honourable Gentleman and others have legitimately pointed out, NHS Test and Trace is now conducting more tests than any other country in Europe. And I think we should be proud of that, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Edward Davey.
Mr. Speaker, there was one major omission from the Prime Minister's statement, an apology. So will the government now apologise for his government's gross incompetence over testing, over tracing, over clear communications that have led to these latest restrictions on people's daily lives? And, Mr. Speaker, as families and businesses look forward, especially to Christmas, how will the government support the millions of people who are on the brink of losing their jobs, losing their businesses, losing their livelihoods? What is the new plan for them?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the plan is that we should continue to keep the economy moving in the way that I have described and the way that the government has set out, and which I believe is supported by the opposition quite rightly, whilst suppressing the R, whilst getting the virus down. That is our policy. Does he support it?
Greg Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the lessons of the lockdown measures in the spring was that they worked, but almost everyone ended up wishing that they'd been introduced a week or two earlier. So I believe the Prime Minister is right to act in anticipation rather than in reaction. But will he take the public into his confidence and say, is the 6 months that he mentioned, irrespective of the experience of infections and hospitalisation over the weeks and months ahead? And what will be the criteria for lifting these restrictions and others like the rule of 6?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend asked a really important question, and the answer is, of course, that we must look at what the data tells us. And above all, we look at, there are several important data, but the R is perhaps the crucial one, but we also look at rates of admissions to hospitals and new infections. And if those facts change, and if things turn around, and if the British public can do what they did before, and get this virus down and get it under control, then of course we will review the measures and review the situation, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is right that testing is a vital part of the government's response to the coronavirus. And will he join me in commending companies like Randox and Fortress Diagnostics in Northern Ireland, who played a vital role at national level in helping to deliver the government's testing programme? Indeed, Randox has committed 99% of its COVID testing capacity to that programme, and on the 19th of September they successfully reported almost 10,000 samples beyond their committed daily rate. Will the Prime Minister consider providing access to testing through local community pharmacies to expand the capacity and public accessibility to testing at this time?
Mr. Speaker, I do indeed congratulate Randox and all the other businesses involved, and we are massively expanding testing the whole time. I think it's very important for the House to understand that testing alone cannot fix this problem. Indeed, there is a hiatus in the logic of the attacks that are sometimes mounted. The problem that we have in the spread of this virus is that, alas, a minority of people have not been following the guidance in the way that they might have done, and what we're trying to do now is to get everybody to focus on those rules, on that guidance, to enforce it strictly and to get the R down.
Manchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for all his hard work during these difficult, challenging times to keep us all safe. The Prime Minister will be aware that I've previously put forward 2 private members' bills to improve mental health care provision for all, which were supported by the Royal College of Psychiatrists. This morning, I spoke with Professor Ellen Young from King's College London, who raised with me real concerns with regards to the reduction in mental health care provision for those with severe mental health issues during COVID-19. Will the Prime Minister please urgently look into this matter and the representations which I will forward to his office from experts such as Professor Young?
Well,
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I look forward to receiving those representations. I will study them carefully. As the House has heard before, Mr. Speaker, the government is spending £12 billion more on mental health provision. Plus, throughout this pandemic, we've been putting extra cash into mental health charities, but I will certainly look at the case that he raises.
Liz Saville-Robert.
Diolch Llefarydd. At the start of the pandemic, there were concerns that visitors were gathering in crowds at beauty spots like Hyrwyddfa, Snowdon. This happened again last weekend. Local lockdowns in Wales now require people to remain within their local authority area except for essential reasons. No such requirement exists in England. In those unfortunate situations where people face local lockdowns, will he give clear guidance against out-of-area travel for leisure purposes?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, for local lockdowns, the guidance is given by the local authorities following the decision in COVID-0 about exactly what restrictions are to be placed. But clearly, the restriction she places she suggests is part of the mix.
Steve Bryan.
And I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and for being here today in person, answering our questions. Surely the reality, Prime Minister, is that national lockdown has one shot, and any repeat of that, with the inevitable unlock that follows, reintroduces an increased element of opportunity for the virus and then risk for us, as we're seeing now. So would the Prime Minister agree that all of these restrictions on our constituents' lives require their ongoing consent, and it's incumbent on government, the scientists who advise him, and Parliament to stress test these decisions and, crucially, the evidence that lies behind them?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do agree with that, and I think it will be greatly to the advantage of the debate and to the country for these questions to be discussed in the House in the way that I've outlined earlier and already proposed by our right honourable friend, the member for Amersham.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The public have shown a vast capacity for putting others first during this pandemic, and now they're being asked to do more. But in return, the government needs to do more for them. Public consent is dependent on not being forced into financial ruin. So will he ensure that the sectors most affected, like hospitality and the arts, continue to get the financial support that they need? And in particular, will he meet with me and other honourable members to find solutions for over 3 million self-employed people who have not been covered by existing financial schemes? He says he's going to put his arms around the whole workforce. Many millions of the self-employed have not felt the benefit of that embrace.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, she raises an important point, and we have extended loans, grants to every conceivable sector of the economy, and we will do more, 1.57 billion to the arts sector alone that she mentions, and we will of course do more. But the most important thing we can do, Mrs. Speaker, and I return to the central message I'm trying to get over today, is that we've got to push down on the R while simultaneously allowing as much of the economy to flourish as we possibly can. And that is our collective objective today.
Andrew Passy.
Speaker, the country is now full of amateur infection control experts, amateur epidemiologists, the odd Captain Hindsight, and I don't intend to be one of those, but I must express to him the concern of constituents in my area where our 7-day rolling average is now well below 20 and falling, where people have followed the rules, have seen people at protests, at street parties, not having action taken against them, and we will now suffer as a result of these further measures. To support them, though, I do, and in particular hospitality will suffer. So can I urge him to look again at the government's plans to halve the small brewers rate relief, which will damage small brewers, particularly craft brewers, and can we look again at that? This is not the time to be introducing introducing such changes?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he speaks eloquently, my honourable friend speaks eloquently for his constituents and those who feel let down by the minority who are not enforcing, not obeying the rules. That's why we're outlining this programme of tough enforcement today, and I will certainly look at the, I will certainly ask my right honourable friend the Chancellor to look at the fiscal measures that he proposes in respect of small brewers.
Stephen Fire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will have support for taking the necessary measures to contain and suppress the virus. But he is receiving a very strong message from both sides of the House today that he does need to revisit the economic support measures, particularly in light of changed circumstances and bearing in mind the need to look at other creative and innovative solutions. So therefore, will he accept that whenever the Chancellor made a statement back at the beginning of July, there was a certain set of planning assumptions. Those no longer apply with the virus. Therefore, it is incumbent on the government to change course on what they're doing to support people as well.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I acknowledge the point that the honourable gentleman has made, and it's certainly our intention as we go forward to do everything we can, as I've said, to protect lives, livelihoods, put our arms around everyone in this country. I think no one can deny that the Chancellor has been exceptionally creative and ambitious in the plans that he's set out, and he will continue to apply the maximum possible imagination and creativity in this respect.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you. Don Valley appreciates all the work the Prime Minister and his team are carrying out in response to the recent rise in the cases of COVID-19. That said, I must say to my right honourable friend that blanket restrictions are affecting all people of all ages immaterial of the actual risk posed to them. Could the government therefore not ask individuals to carry out a personal COVID risk assessment, the results of which could determine whether someone needs to shield or can go about their daily lives? This will help boost the economy while protecting the vulnerable. After all, many people's lives are being affected tremendously by these restrictions, especially the young, who, as we all know, are only young once.
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend really puts his finger on the heart of the problem, of the dilemma, because of course the tragedy of the coronavirus epidemic is that people who are not badly affected themselves can nonetheless pass it on unwittingly to older or more vulnerable people. So your harmless cough can be someone else's death knell, unfortunately, and that is why we have to apply the restrictions that we do. But he's right also to look ahead to a time when I do believe we will be able much more easily to identify, Mr. Speaker, whether or not we are infectious, and to allow us, therefore, to go about our daily lives more easily, young and old.
Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By 6 p.m. this evening, both local authorities covering my constituency will be under Welsh Government local lockdown restrictions aimed at slowing the spread of the virus. Among the restrictions will be a restriction on holiday travel, meaning that constituents will not be able to go on planned holidays. And some holiday companies are refusing refunds on the grounds that local restrictions are not covered by UK law, and pointing instead to Foreign and Commonwealth Office advice on travel. Yeah. So what can the Prime Minister do to support constituents in this case, and what is his message to those holiday companies?
Good question. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he asked an excellent question, and it's not an anomaly that I'd hitherto been aware of, but if he would care to write to me with the details of his constituents' concerns, I will certainly take it up.
Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Darrett Valley Hospital in my constituency did an amazing job at the heart of the outbreak, as did many of my local GP surgeries. However, they were under huge pressure. Therefore, would the Prime Minister consider extending the ability of local pharmacies and chemists to administer health treatment so these gems on our high street are able to ease the pressure on our health system?
I thank my honourable friend, and he's completely right that pharmacies and chemists are in the front line of our healthcare and do an absolutely outstanding job in testing people for all kinds of things, COVID amongst them, and we will certainly support them in any way that we can.
Let's head to Kenny McCaskill in Scotland. Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We may well have to endure for 6 months or more, but it's less than 6 weeks until furlough scheme ends. Germany, France and even Ireland are extending furlough schemes for specific sectors. It's a political, not a health decision. Many communities in my constituency were devastated by political decisions made by a Tory government in the 1980s that wreaked mass unemployment. Are they now to have that revisited upon them in 2020, or will the Prime Minister extend the furlough scheme?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the comparisons with other European countries are actually illuminating because the furlough scheme was far more generous than either Germany or France or virtually any other country in Europe. And what we will continue to do is, as I've said repeatedly to the House, is to put our arms around the workers of this country to make sure that we help people throughout the crisis, but also, as I have told you before, Mr. Speaker, to do everything we can to keep our economy moving and keep people in work wherever we can.
Let's head down to Devon with Mel Stride. Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the balanced and proportionate set of measures that my right honourable friend has put together, and also recognise that these are very finely balanced and very difficult decisions for him to take. But lockdowns, as I think my right honourable friend recognises, destroy jobs and also personal well-being. And the fact that lockdowns have damaged our economy means that in the years ahead, a smaller economy will probably have serious impacts on the health of millions of people up and down our country. So does my right honourable friend recognise that, yes, we should listen very carefully to the epidemiologists, but we must also listen very carefully to the Treasury, to businesses and to economists too?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is spot on. That's why we have to take action now to avoid the risk of having to take more drastic action later on that would do greater economic damage. And that is the key point of what we're doing today.
We're heading up to Kingston on Hull with Dame Diana Johnson. Dame Diana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister explain why a new test centre opening today on Hull University land for students and the local community, and one, of course, of which I welcome, will be run by private firms Deloitte and G4S with no accountability to local bodies with statutory public health responsibilities for the local community, or the university, who are, of course, responsible for their students? How does this silo approach that the Prime Minister has created around testing help us to have a joined-up approach that we all want in Hull to tackle this pandemic?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I will study what she says about the testing unit in Hull University, but everywhere across the country, NHS Test and Trace has been working hand in glove with local authorities to get testing done, working hand in glove with Public Health England and, of course, with all our public services. And I'm surprised by what she says about the testing unit at Hull University, but I will certainly ask NHS Test and Trace to give her a full explanation. But in my experience, everything is done to enlist and mobilise the expertise of local government to get the testing done.
Richard Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many people are concerned with this dominant focus on COVID that people who need NHS treatment for other illnesses or are seeking elective surgery are going to be pushed further back in the queue. So can the Prime Minister assure us and make sure that the Health Secretary gives a priority to communicating the progress in dealing with the backlog in these surgeries as we go through the winter period?
Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we must do everything we can to ensure that our NHS is not overwhelmed with COVID cases. And it's when you have a COVID crisis, a boom in COVID cases, that, as he rightly points out, other needs, other cardiac cancer cases are pushed off. And that is completely wrong. And that's why it is so vital now that we suppress the R, that we drive the rate of infection down, and we stop a boom in COVID cases, because that is the threat to our NHS and to the provision of all the basic services on which our country relies.
Karen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's objective does rely on the local public health effort, and I want to thank the local NHS in Bristol, Bristol City Council and Public Health England in the South West for the remarkable work they are doing. But reorganising health services always distracts from their job, it destroys morale and it wastes money. So, can the Prime Minister explain to us the benefits of abolishing Public Health England in the middle of this crisis? And if he can't, will he commit now to reversing that decision, at least until we have an inquiry?
Prime Minister.
I think it's absolutely essential that we have the most powerful possible public health organisation in this country, and the National Biosecurity Centre now needs to come together with Public Health England to deliver what I believe will be a better service for this country. In fact, the change to which she refers doesn't happen until next year, but we're getting it underway now.
Secretary Batty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister is a true libertarian and he must have agonised over the decision of today and over recent months. But my constituents in Meriden are, however, concerned about a second national lockdown, about schools closing, about businesses shutting down. So does my right honourable friend agree that individual responsibility is more important today than it's ever been? And will he confirm that he will do everything he can to avoid a second full national lockdown?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend. The whole objective today is to avoid that second national lockdown. Nobody wants to see that, and he's indeed right to point the finger at us all. We can do this together if we take responsibility for the way we behave, the way we enforce the rules, the way we act in public places. That is how we will get the R down collectively and defeat the virus.
Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, back in July, the government introduced the planning bill, which allowed the sale of alcohol off the premises and the consumption off the premises for as long as the licence of those licensed premises. Today, just a week later, the Prime Minister has come to the House saying that there will be no sales, no service in hospitality after 10 o'clock at night. Can he explain the rationale behind that 10 o'clock curfew and the very fast turn of change of plan by the government?
Minister.
She's raising a very important point, and I'm grateful. As members have said across the House, these are not easy decisions. Nobody wants to be curtailing the right of restaurants and other businesses to go about their lawful business. What we've seen from the evidence is that, alas, the spread of the disease does tend to happen later at night after more alcohol has been consumed. This is one way that we see of driving down the R without doing excessive economic damage, and that's the balance we have to strike.
Heading up to Fylde, Lancashire with Mark Menzies. Mark Menzies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the measures that the Right Honourable Friend, the Prime Minister, has laid before the House today? Can I also say to him that people who are vulnerable to COVID are also extremely vulnerable to seasonal flu, a disease that's killed over 11,000 people last year in the UK alone, but is also one of the biggest sources of winter pressures upon the NHS. In the summer, the government promised one of the largest flu vaccination programmes in history. Can my Right Honourable Friend update the House on what's being done to deliver this?
Minister.
Yes, indeed, I can, Mr. Speaker. I can tell my honourable friend that the biggest flu vaccine programme is going ahead as we speak, and 30 million people will be able to have a flu jab this autumn, and I thoroughly advise members to get one.
Heading up to Livingston to Hannah Bardell. Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There is a wee whiff of hypocrisy, because as the Prime Minister and his Cabinet bring in new measures to combat COVID-19, the Prime Minister needs to tell us how he expects citizens across the UK to follow his rules and laws when he and his government are openly admitting that they're willing to break international law and treaties themselves.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think everybody in this House wants to see the people of this country and to help the people of this country to obey the law of the land and to get the virus down, and that is the objective of this government.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, children are very unlikely to be harmed by this virus, and they're also less likely to spread it. But in my roles as a children's doctor, as a member of the Education Select Committee, and as a constituency MP, I've seen examples of where children have been harmed by not being in school. Can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, reassure this House that he will do everything within his power to keep schools open?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank her for what she does, but also the tens of millions of parents, teachers, pupils up and down the country who rose to the occasion at the beginning of this month and did go back to school, and in overwhelming numbers they are still at school in spite of the difficulties that they are currently facing. And she is so right. It is vital for children, young people, to be in school, and we will do everything in our power to ensure that that remains the case.
Honourables.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister will no doubt be aware of the alarming rate at which coronavirus cases are rising among BAME groups, and in particular among the Asian population, with some 34% of coronavirus patients in intensive care right now being from ethnic minorities. So could he tell the House how he thinks shutting pubs an hour earlier will address this worrying trend, and what action has his government taken to tackle the disproportionate impact on ethnic minorities since PHE published its report in June?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her very much for the question. What we've done, as she knows possibly already, is that we have targeted testing and protection for those, enhanced protection for those in frontline groups, many of whom come from black and minority ethnic groups, and what we're also doing in order to stop the spread of infection in some communities is working much harder with local government and local communities to get the messaging into those communities about the risks of transmission and the basic rules about hands, face, space. That's among some of the things that we're doing.
Heading down to Chatham to Tracy Crouch. Tracy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sport and physical activity contributes over £16 billion to the UK economy. It directly employs over 600,000 people and indirectly many more. It has an ecosystem that reaches beyond the pitch, field, court or pool, and its social value, which includes physical and mental wellbeing, is estimated at more than £72 billion. And yet right now, both codes of rugby, football, cricket, netball, hockey, tennis, swimming, to name but a few, are in a perilous situation due to spectators not being able to return and venues unable to host income-raising events such as conferences. Sport and all it directly and indirectly involves cannot continue to face these kind of losses. So given today's announcement, which pauses the return of spectators, will the Prime Minister elaborate on his comments regarding a financial support package to ensure that it isn't left decimated after the pandemic?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right to draw attention to the huge importance of sport to our national economy and to our well-being. And that's why my right honourable friend, Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, is now working flat out with the Premier League and others to identify ways in which we can keep these clubs going. We can support sport at all levels throughout the pandemic. And one of the things that we're not doing, as she will appreciate today, is we're not stopping outdoor physical exercise. We're not stopping team sports outside. We want that to continue. But that's why it's vital that we enforce the package of measures that we have outlined today.
Graham Boris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you'll be aware of the recent imposition of further restrictions in the northeast of England. So first of all, can I thank the Prime Minister for listening and acting upon concerns, both individually and collectively, from the Northern Group of Labour MPs about informal childcare arrangements in my constituency and others. However, before he feels my warm embrace, can I ask him in relation to the latest announcement on restrictions on businesses? Can I ask him to provide assurances to businesses in my constituency by outlining what sector-specific support his government will offer to those worst affected by COVID, such as the coach sector, which is on the brink of collapse due to government inaction in the main and the failure to listen to the Honk for Hope campaign?
Well, Prime Minister.
We will do whatever we can to support the coach sector and indeed all other sectors across the country. We've as he knows, put into place a massive programme of loans, of grants and support of all kind. But it is clear that the best thing for businesses in his constituency and across the country is not to paralyse the economy now, not to go back into lockdown, but to defeat the virus insofar as we possibly can and allow the economy to move forward. But we will continue to give whatever help we can.
Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, I'm thankful for my right honourable friend's commitments on parliamentary scrutiny. He'll know many members of the House and of the public are concerned about the use of delegated powers, and I'm sure he'll remember the sifting committee from the EU Withdrawal Act. Could I invite him to please consider whether some innovative thinking can be applied to make sure that the authority of this House is brought to bear in advance on these measures, so that the public can have confidence that their representatives are authorising the use of law to constrain their freedom.
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, under the current procedures, it is up to the House to confirm that the Executive does have the power to continue with measures under the Coronavirus Act, and that will continue to be the case. And we are additionally offering and insisting, Mr. Speaker, that there should be a proper debate of these issues in Parliament, because there are many different opinions in Parliament, and I think people need to air them together.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Children were delighted to return to their primary schools earlier this month, but not surprisingly, after 6 months of isolation, coughs and colds have spread rapidly amongst them since, and we've been reminded that each primary school has just 10 COVID tests. So when will primary schools have the wherewithal to test children and staff with symptoms to avoid spreading the virus at school and also avoid unnecessary school closures?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he's spot on about what's been happening with in schools, and sadly, I think in many cases we've seen a rise in the demand for tests because people are reasonably unable to distinguish between the symptoms of COVID or a seasonal cough or cold. We're trying to address it as fast as we possibly can, but the one consolation we have in this is two things. Children are much less likely to suffer seriously from the disease, if at all, and they're much less capable, it seems, of spreading it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and for his steadfast service to our country during this very difficult time. The Prime Minister understands the long-term harm a second lockdown would cause to people across the country, to their health, their lives, their livelihoods, as they try their very best to get back on their feet. Will the Prime Minister consider targeting protective measures for those most at risk, rather than deploying the blunt instrument which is lockdown, which we know causes so much suffering and which offers no hope of a cure?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, she's right about both things, and we are doing everything we can to protect particularly those in care homes who are so vulnerable, as we saw in the early stages of this pandemic, and we've massively increased the winter plan, action plan for care homes. Another 546 million gone in, stopping movement between care homes and taking the very tough decision to stop visits to care homes in lockdown areas, which is very, very difficult for elderly people who are in a care home. And the reason that we're taking those measures, and now those difficult measures now, Mr. Speaker, is because we want to avoid another national lockdown of exactly the type that she rightly wants to avoid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of my constituents have been waiting 4 days, 5 days or even longer to get their test results back. The government rightly promised in July that 80% of in-person tests would get their results in 24 hours from booking. That is now down to below 20%. That is dangerous. It means people are not in the tracing system. It means their contacts aren't being traced. It makes it easier for the virus to spread, and it makes it more likely that we will face even tougher restrictions that the Prime Minister has described across the whole country. So given that the government made so many mistakes on testing in the first wave, we cannot afford for him to get this wrong again now. When will that 80% target now be met?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in spite of the massive increase in testing that we've seen, 10% increase in capacity just in the last 10 days or so, we are seeing at the moment 64% of people getting their results in 24 hours, and I do want to get that up as fast as possible to 80%. What I can tell her is that we will double our testing capacity by the end of October to 500,000 tests a day, and we are already testing more people than any other country in Europe.
Permission to land the question, Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and clear statement of purpose to conquer this terrible virus. One of the key concerns locally, however, has been the failure to comply with the regulations of wearing a face covering in shops and on public transport. Clearly, with these new restrictions coming into place, one of the key issues is going to be sure that people actually comply with these requirements. Equally, people do not want to get to a position whereby they're forced to wear a face covering in the open air, just going about their normal business. Can my right honourable friend state for the House what he's going to do to make sure that the message gets across to people that failing to comply with these rules is really selfish and potentially placing other people at risk?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend is spot on, and that's why we're increasing the fines from £100 to £200. You're protecting yourself, you're protecting other people, you wear a face covering where you should.
Heading to Leeds with Richard Bergen. Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shamefully, the UK's had one of the highest coronavirus death rates in the world. If we'd had Germany's deaths per million rate, we'd have over 30,000 fewer coronavirus deaths. If we'd had the much lower death rate of South Korea and New Zealand, we'd have over 40,000 fewer deaths. So will the Prime Minister take responsibility for our unacceptably high death rates, and to avoid a repeat this winter, will he now pursue the zero COVID strategy that independent SAGE is calling for, and that countries like South Korea and New Zealand are successfully implementing?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what we're pursuing with the support of the opposition is a policy of driving this virus down whilst allowing our education and our economy to continue, and I hope that he will lend his support to that effort as well.
Paul Bristow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and for his leadership during this crisis. But will he also commit to a vote in this House prior to any further steps towards a full second national lockdown?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. We are continuing to expand testing and tracing, and it is by driving down this virus that we will, I believe, be able to take the country forward to a much, much brighter future. And if people focus on the measures that we've outlined today, particularly on obeying the guidance for social distancing, that together we will defeat COVID.
Heading to Scotland with Peter Grant. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear this afternoon that there's a significant level of agreement across the House that the restrictions the Prime Minister has announced, although not necessarily popular, are necessary. There's also a great deal of cross-party agreement that the support schemes for businesses need to be extended at the same time as the restrictions are extended. So can I ask the Prime Minister, rather than simply rejecting it out of hand, to agree to the invitation to speak to business leaders, to trade union leaders and to opposition parties to put together a financial support scheme, not only for those employees who currently rely on furlough, but for the tens of thousands of small business owners who have been left without any support at all during the last 6 months?
Well, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've had the opportunity in the course of the last few months to talk to many businesses up and down the country, across Scotland, and they have been uniformly appreciative of the support that the government has given so far. I must say, and we will ensure, as I said earlier on, that we will maintain a very creative and imaginative approach in helping those businesses. But the best thing we can do is fight the virus and keep the economy moving.
Rick Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the PM for his statement. And he is right to say that it is the cooperation and good sense of the British public that has saw the spread of this difficult outbreak curtailed. My constituents will continue to do exactly what's required of them, but the truth is that Cornwall has a very low rate of COVID-19, and this has been the case throughout. So what message of hope can the Prime Minister give to teenagers who are going to school and colleges being asked to wear face masks when not in class, to churchgoers who are being blocked from freedom of worship, and to businesses who have yet to open and are continually frustrated from doing so?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, churchgoers, I don't think the churchgoers will continue to have a freedom of worship under these proposals, and we want life as far as we possibly can to keep going as normally as possible. We want the economy to keep moving. But what I think the best hope I can offer to his constituencies whom he fights so valiantly, is that we get this virus back under control and take the country forward and keep the economy moving. And that is the best prospect for our country.
Ben Bradshaw.
Does he think that the reason Germany and Italy have far lower COVID rates than us, with life continuing more or less normally, might be because they have locally and publicly run test and trace services that actually work?
No, Mr. Speaker, I don't. And I think the continual attacks on local test and trace and what the NHS test and trace have done are undermining and unnecessary. And actually, there is an important difference between our country and many other countries around the world, and that is our country is a freedom-loving country, Mr. Speaker. And if you look at the history of this country over the last 300 years, virtually every advance from free speech to democracy has come from this country. And it is very difficult to ask the British population uniformly to obey guidelines in the way that it is necessary. What we're saying today is that collectively, and I'm answering his question directly, collectively, the way to do this is for us all to follow the guidelines, which we will strictly enforce and get the R down. That's the way forward.
Rob Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciating the frustrations for people who currently have symptoms and are finding it difficult to get tests currently, would my right honourable friend agree with me that capacity going up by over 10% in the last few weeks, 4 new labs coming online and hundreds of additional staff, we can reach our target of 500,000 tests a day by the end of October? And would he agree with me that it would be an amazing achievement against a virus that we were only first learning about a few short months ago?
Mr. Speaker, I do, you will not surprise my honourable friend to know that I fervently agree with the way he characterises the achievements of NHS test and trace. And I think that his optimism and his encouragement of NHS test and trace could reasonably be echoed on the benches opposite.
Heading up to Greater Manchester with Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Manchester is home to 2 of the largest universities in the country with a combined student body of nearly 80,000, many of whom choose to live in my constituency of Manchester Gorton. With so many students returning to the area, this is an incredibly difficult time for the community, the students, and their families who are concerned for their safety. With the surge in infections and the second wave now evident, what advice does the government intend on giving to universities on keeping their students, staff, and the wider community safe?
Prime Minister. Thank you, honourable gentleman. The most important thing is that the students who are now back at university in large numbers should, like everybody else, follow the guidelines. And it's also important, Mr. Speaker, but where there are outbreaks in universities, that students should not be going home to infect their older relatives.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The districts of Wealdon and Rother that comprise my constituency have recorded in the last week just 4 COVID conditions per 100,000 population each. Can I ask the Prime Minister, he said that palpable progress will need to be made if this is not to last for 6 months in terms of his new measures. Can I ask him to consider whether those areas that have lower rates will be freed from these restrictions perhaps earlier if progress is indeed made across the nation?
Well, of course, Mr. Speaker, and that's why, and I thank my honourable friend, that's why we're confiding our hopes and our confidence in a local, regional approach rather than a blanket one-size-fits-all national approach. And we hope to be, and we hope that those areas that are complying with the rules and those people, there's many, the vast majority that are complying with the rules, will be able to see the opportunity that he describes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister calls it NHS test and trace, but wouldn't it be more accurate to call it Serco test and trace? Yeah. It has been outsourced, like other health contracts, often to friends and family members of Tory MPs, lining their pockets while taking the public for a ride. In spite of its record of failure, last week Serco was handed another test and trace contract worth £45 million. Mr. Speaker, these giant corporations put private profit before public health. Isn't it time to end the scandal of outsourcing and bring these contracts into public hands for a genuine NHS test and trace?
I have to say, I think she's grossly undermining the huge effort of local authorities that are an integral part of NHS test and trace. They're doing a magnificent job. I thank each and every one of those individuals for what they are doing, and we're putting another £300 million into supporting local authorities deliver test and trace. And of course it's right that we should reach out across the entire UK economy to help, and indeed the armed services, to help us deliver on this enormous project, and we'll continue to do so.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the work that's been done across the four nations in recent days, as people expect our governments to work together and unite as we tackle this virus. But given these restrictive measures could be with us across the UK for the next 6 months or longer, what guarantee can the Prime Minister give that this UK government will continue to support Scottish employers and workers in areas affected by these measures when the furlough scheme ends?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and as I've said to Scottish colleagues across the House, we will continue to put our arms around workers and firms, businesses, around jobs across the country. And that's why the furlough scheme was rolled out, the most imaginative and most generous of any such scheme in Europe. And as I said, we're providing for every person in Scotland an extra £1,200 to help fight coronavirus, and 5.3 billion more announced just this summer alone. So, Mr. Speaker, the people of Scotland and the people of the whole UK can count on this government to stand by them throughout the crisis.
Jim Shannon.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement today, but can the Prime Minister confirm that scheduled surgeries such as hip replacement, removal of tonsils, cancer surgeries, diabetic screening and treatment will continue with high standards of protection in place, and that we will not see people falling through the gaps, and those in the long waiting list will be reduced?
Mr. Speaker, the whole objective of trying to prevent another boom in coronavirus suffering, a boom in coronavirus patients, is to protect the NHS and to allow scheduled surgery of the kind he describes to continue.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, in Stoke-on-Trent, North Kidsgrove and Talk, schools such as the Excel Academy and Ormiston Horizon Academy have staff and students testing positive for coronavirus. Would my right honourable friend share my concerns about staff and students being away from the classroom as they await testing? And would he agree with me that schools should be prioritised for testing to ensure both staff and students are back in the classroom as soon as possible?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank staff and students in his constituency and across the country for the 99.9% of schools that are now back open again. The vast majority of pupils back in their schools. They should have confidence to be there, and they're in the right place. It's by far the best place for them to be, and we are sending out new test kits the whole time, and there is an online portal through which every school can now access the tests that they need.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liverpool begins local lockdown measures today. When restrictions were first imposed 6 months ago, the Prime Minister outlined a package of financial support for local government. We did all that was asked of us, but we have now been left with a £23 million funding gap. What support is the Prime Minister able to announce today for hard-hit councils?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've told the Honourable Lady before, I believe we've put about £3.7 billion into supporting local government. We'll continue to support local government, and I'll look at the £23 million funding gap that she raises with me today.
Crab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While working from home has been great for many, for senior managers living in larger properties with nice gardens, that hasn't been the experience for a great many others living in cramped, overcrowded accommodation. So does my right honourable friend recognise that there will be dismay today amongst those people for whom a return to COVID-secure workplaces have been so important for mental, physical, social well-being and it feels like it will be a long 6 months for them having to work back in their own homes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, but it's very important that he should not misunderstand what we're saying today. Where people must go into work for their job, for their mental health, for their well-being, or whatever it happens to be, then of course they should do so. What we're saying is that you should work from home if you can. I hope that he appreciates the distinction and give his constituents that reassurance.
Heading up to Scotland with Miriam Fellows. Miriam Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor pledged at the start of this crisis that the UK government would do whatever it takes to help people. The Prime Minister has said today that he will put his arms around the workers of this country. So if these statements are to be believed, will the Prime Minister commit to extending the furlough to save jobs in Motherwell and Wishaw and across the UK? And for those not in work, will he make permanent the £20 uplift to universal credit and extend this uplift to all legacy benefits?
Well, I'm glad, Mr. Speaker, that she draws attention to the increase in universal credit, probably worth about £4,000 to the poorest families in our country. I'm proud of what we've done also on the living wage, and I can tell her that, of course, we will continue to support people across this country. But the most important thing, to repeat my point, Mr. Speaker, is for the economy to keep moving, for jobs to be created, and for people to get back into work.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Colne Valley constituency, as part of Kirklees, goes back into local restrictions today. And, Mr. Speaker, we've just heard about these new measures, which may last up to 6 months, taking us through the busy Christmas period. Can I ask the Prime Minister to ask the Chancellor if he will now lay out a financial support package for hospitality, the likes of the wedding industry, marquee companies, small breweries, freelance musicians and performers, even event venues, and many, many more whose livelihoods will be impacted by the measures he's announced today?
Mr. Speaker, the sectors that he refers to have in many respects already been provided for and supported, but clearly there will be further demands, and I know that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will be applying, as I say, his imagination and his creativity to helping those sectors in the months ahead. But the best thing for them is to get back to life as close to normal as possible by getting this virus down. And that is the point of the package of measures that we're announcing today.
Vendu Mishra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, I received a letter from the Health Minister informing me that a new COVID testing centre would be available for my Stockport constituents, some 240 miles away at the University of Greenwich campus in Kent. Whilst I'm willing to accept that this may have been an administrative error, it is entirely possible that the letter is accurate, given many of my constituents are already having to travel more than 70 miles away for a test in Telford. Isn't it time that this government got a grip and provided comprehensive testing like our partner countries, or will its shambolic handling of this pandemic once again lead to the highest COVID death toll in Europe in the imminent second wave?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I must correct his figures. We're now testing more than any other country in Europe, and the median journey is, I think, about 5.8 miles, and no journey is permitted to be more than 75 miles. So I don't recognise the figures that I've heard from him.
Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency, Haywood and Middleton, is one of several under local measures and has been for several weeks. So I'd like to pay tribute to my constituents, businesses, individuals and families who have made great sacrifices to keep this country safe. So in welcoming today's statement, can I ask the Prime Minister for an assurance that this represents a circuit break and not a hard wiring of policy, and that as this is reviewed, we will follow all the scientific data to make sure we get back to normal as soon as possible?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Well, the intention of these measures is collectively to depress the R, but to keep the economy and education functioning. That's what we're trying to do.
Heading up to Gateshead with Ian Mearns. Ian Mearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister, for the sake of absolute clarity and for the removal of any doubt over potential mixed messaging, please confirm that what he's announced today in terms of measures in the national context does not supersede or dilute the more stringent measures announced last week for Tyne and Wear, Northumberland and Durham, where case numbers have sadly been growing rapidly despite a local reduction in testing capacity. And will he also confirm what additional support he will put in place for businesses and workers in the North East in sectors where activity has been greatly reduced by COVID restrictions?
He's completely right in what he says about the areas currently in local lockdown measures, and we are, of course, doing giving them extra support to get them through lockdown as he would expect.
Susan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in thanking all those who are on the front line at the COVID-19 test centres and in the labs, working so incredibly hard to keep up with the unprecedented demand as we grow our testing capacity to 500,000 a day by the end of October?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I thank each and every one of the people involved in NHS Test and Trace. I think that they're doing an outstanding job in spite of the massive increase in demand, and I'm delighted that she's paid tribute to them just now.
Sir,
thank you, Mr. Speaker. How does the Prime Minister justify recent reports that every child at Eton gets a COVID test, while currently 10% of children and staff at Jill Blower's nursery in Luton are having to stay at home and isolate while they wait for tests that show no sign of coming? Can he tell us how many school children are currently self-isolating because they cannot afford to buy their own tests? And if there's so much spare capacity, why is it that not every child can get a test when they need it?
Mr. Speaker, every child with symptoms should automatically get a test, and that is everybody with symptoms should get a test. And I can tell her that we are massively expanding testing across the country. But I repeat the points that I made earlier on. It's one of the few things for which we can be thankful about this epidemic, that it does affect children and young people, the youngest of all, much less than older people, and there is much less evidence that they pass it on in the way that other people do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the best way to support our heroic staff at Russell's Hall Hospital in Dudley, our care staff and indeed our residents in our care homes, is to actually reinforce the central message of washing our hands, maintain social distancing and wear face covering where appropriate?
Mr. Speaker, he puts it, my honourable friend puts it very well and very succinctly, and I really couldn't add anything to what he said.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the most shocking aspects of the coronavirus pandemic has been the disproportionate impact on Black, Asian and minority ethnic residents. When Public Health England published a report documenting this injustice, the government was warned that it needed to act immediately to stop further preventable deaths. But we have seen no urgency, and the chair of the British Medical Association is now warning that government inaction will lead to more preventable deaths of Black, Asian and minority ethnic residents over the winter. What is the Prime Minister going to do about it?
Mr. Speaker, I already mentioned earlier on that we have done a great deal to target measures to protect those in frontline jobs, including many from Black and minority ethnic groups. And I thank and I pay tribute to those public servants, many of them who have done such a fantastic job throughout this crisis at great personal risk. And I really thank them for what they're doing. We are doing everything we can to protect them. And of course, where there are vulnerable communities that need to understand the guidance about coronavirus, we're doing everything we can to get the messages home. And those are just some of the things the government is doing.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend say to what extent the measures he has announced today are being coordinated with the devolved administrations? I raise the issue because in Wales the different arrangements have sometimes been the cause of confusion, not least because most Welsh residents take their news from the London-based media.
Well, Mr. Speaker, actually over the last few weeks and months there's been exceptionally high degree of collaboration between the UK government and all the devolved administrations, and yesterday had good conversations with Mark Drakeford about what he's doing, and it bears an uncanny resemblance to what the rest of the UK is doing.
Olivia Blake.
Mr.
Speaker, clarity is key to public trust. Many people have been confused by the government's mixed messages on public health measures. Can the Prime Minister guarantee that none of his ministers or advisers will contradict the rules he set out today, and if they do so, that they will be disciplined?
Mr. Speaker, it's up to all of us to obey the guidance and to urge everybody in this country to obey the guidance, follow the rules, because that's the way we'll defeat the virus.
Levy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Blythe Valley has recently faced tighter restrictions as an immediate response to a rise in local cases. I know that these measures are necessary in controlling this deadly virus, but they have a real impact on families, businesses and local communities. I welcome the Right Honourable Member for West Suffolk's decision on lifting the ban on informal childcare yesterday. And Mr. Speaker, I know that this is a move that will be a relief to many of my constituents. Can I ask my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, to continue to do all he can to support families through this tough time?
I thank my honourable friend for the way he represents Blythe Valley, and I can tell him that we will continue to listen to people and continue to respond to their concerns in any way that we can.
David Linden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With 2.4 million households in the UK facing fuel poverty this winter, a figure that will only be exacerbated by the pandemic, will the Prime Minister consider introducing a one-off COVID-19 winter fuel payment to every household at risk?
Mr. Speaker, we will consider all sorts of measures to alleviate poverty and suffering in the months ahead. The best thing we can do is to follow this package of measures scrupulously, drive down the virus, keep the economy moving.
Jim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, the last 6 months have been tough for our country, and it sounds like the next 6 months are going to be too. And it's vital that we take our constituents with us and they have confidence in and understand what's being asked of them. At the beginning of the breakdown of the lockdown, the Prime Minister looked into the camera and said, "I need to level with you folks." And the nation sat up and listened. Can we have more of those level with you moments, where the government gives clear and consistent data with clear explanations of how the regulations are working and why, rather than leaving the people at the mercy of COVID deniers, so-called independent experts, and professors of hindsight?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and we will do everything we can to share the data with you, with Parliament in real time, and give colleagues the opportunity to debate and discuss the issues. And I think the more colleagues are able to look at the facts and study them, they will see that a balanced, proportionate approach such as the one we're taking today is the right one.
Archie.
Speaker, I want to thank all of those working on testing because they're doing remarkable and life-saving work. That doesn't mean that the Prime Minister can simply brush off serious questions about failures in systems on something so crucial to this fight. So can he tell me, has he now fixed the problems in the UK Lighthouse Lab system that have negatively affected Wales and that the Welsh Government is now having to plug the gaps in? And secondly, is it true, as Dido Harding has said, that people will have to pay for his so-called moonshot tests?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not only fixing the problems, but as you know, we're building 4 more lighthouse labs, and on the machines in question that needed to be supplied, we've secured them, and we are moving forward. And I'm confident that we will have the capacity to do another 500,000 tests per day by the end of October, and that's an extraordinary thing. Now, on the ambition for mass testing, I think that's a great thing, and the government will support it.
Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last lockdown, which was quite severe, did succeed in reducing the spread of the virus, but it didn't eradicate it. And what confidence can we have that these measures will actually eradicate it to the extent that we won't be in this chamber in 6 months' time discussing further lockdown measures? What discussions have he had with scientists and health experts to find a proper way forward?
Mr. Speaker, he asked, I think, a most important question, because the virus is not one that is readily capable of being eradicated. And what we have to do is to drive it down as far as we possibly can, and to keep it under control, and to restrict outbreaks as fast and as far as we possibly can. I think riding to our rescue, there will be several things, and riding to the rescue of the economy, there will be several things. First of all, I think that we will be able to continue with the measures that we have to control the virus and to get the R down. That's provided people obey the. Provided people obey, forgive me, Mr. Speaker. Provided people obey the guidelines we set out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, the reason we are facing greater restrictions is because the government have failed to establish an effective testing system. My constituent was not able to access a test for her son, sent home from school and asked to travel 300 miles for a test. Despite the fact I raised this case in this chamber last week and received assurances from the Health Secretary, she still can't get a test and she still has had no contact. Prime Minister, when will you fix the testing system?
Mr. Speaker, I increasingly think it's disgraceful that the Labour opposition continue to blame NHS test and trace for the resurgence of the disease. I really think that is because there is a complete hiatus in their logic. There is a complete hiatus in their logic. They're talking absolute nonsense. It is not testing and tracing has very little or nothing to do with the spread or the transmission of the disease. The spread of the transmission of the disease is caused by contact between human beings and all the things that we're trying to minimise. And that is why, of course, NHS test and trace is vital. But the way to fix the problem now, is for the whole country to follow this package of guidance, drive the R down, and allow both education and the economy to continue. But there is a complete flaw in their logic.
Stephen Hammond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his statement today. It's clear that we as a country now are living with COVID, probably for 6 months, maybe longer. As life keeps going, we know that life changes, so will my right honourable friend commit to regular reviews of these measures to ensure their necessity? And as life keeps going, we need families. So will he have a look at an early review of the rule of 6 for primary school children so they can meet grandparents, cousins, aunts?
Mr. Speaker, we will of course keep all these measures under review continually, and none of them are measures that we want to bring in. They're measures that we believe are necessary, and I'm delighted that they're supported by the party opposite.
Mr. Speaker, I accept the need for these restrictions, but the Prime Minister must know that they come at the worst possible time for hospitality and tourism in Cumbria, in the Lakes, the Dales and elsewhere, because furlough is ending just as the low season begins. Now, he could back the targeted package proposed by the tourism industry and myself to save jobs and businesses through these tough winter months, or he could cost the taxpayer billions in benefits and lost tax revenue if he lets them all go to the wall. So will he meet with me and tourism and hospitality industry leaders so we can find a solution and save jobs?
Well, I thank him for what he says on behalf of the tourism and hospitality industry in his area, which is a fantastic place to visit, and I certainly undertake to ensure that he's able to, or his delegation is able to meet the relevant minister to find a way forward. We will continue to support tourism and hospitality as we have throughout this crisis.
Andrew Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement during these difficult times and congratulate him on rising to the challenge. It's just such a shame that the Leader of the Opposition and the opposition benches have not always had a positive and constructive approach given the severity of our times. Now, in my constituency of Morley and outward, I've been campaigning hard for our high streets, which are facing challenge after challenge. What support can my right honourable friend give retailers during these difficult circumstances?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for what she says, and what we will do. The best thing we can do for retail, which we opened up again in June, as she will recall. The best thing we can do is ensure that we keep retail open, ensure that people can keep going to the shops in a COVID-secure way, Mr. Speaker, on the high streets in morning hours. And that is the way to take our country forward. But the way to do it is to follow this package of measures to the letter, which has, and I'm delighted that it has opposition support, Mr. Speaker. I gather, not, you know, as she rightly says, not uniform or every day, but we've got it today. Let's work with it and get that message across to the country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, the through the testing scheme, we've seen that the BAME population have suffered the most from the COVID-19 virus. What assurances can you give that ethnic minority communities can be prioritised for testing? I want to just give an example from my constituency, which has a very high Bangladeshi population. Among ethnic groups, the Bangladeshi population have suffered the highest number of excess deaths than any other ethnic group. That community is devastated. They really need assurances that they can be prioritised, along with other ethnic groups, for testing. Thank you.
I thank the honourable lady, and we grieve for what's happened in black and minority ethnic communities, and I know that she's right in what she says about the Bangladeshi community. We will do everything we can to get all the groups in our country that need testing, the testing that they deserve as fast as we possibly can. All I can tell her is that we have hugely expanded our testing capacity. There is a hierarchy of need, of priority groups that she'll have seen. We will do everything that we can to ensure that black and minority ethnic groups get the support, get the protections that we need, that they need, in addition to the measures that we've already taken, which I outlined earlier, Mr. Speaker.
Final question from Andrew Slow.
Constituents who've spent a lifetime in public service wrote to me over the weekend saying we're on the point of giving up. Churchill said he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat, but Jeremiah 29 talks about giving us a hope and a future. So what can the Prime Minister say to people to give them a hope as we go forward over the next 6 months as we deal with this dismal pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, I think we have every hope. I think you cut me off, Mr. Speaker, when I was going to answer an earlier question, quite properly, Mr. Speaker. But the answer, Mr. Speaker, is that we have not only, I think we have every chance if we follow this package of measures of driving the R down, of keeping our economy moving, keeping education going, but science is helping us every day. Dexamethasone, trialled in this country, is now reducing the number of deaths. We have the prospect of a vaccine, and all the medical guidance I have, Mr. Speaker, is that by next spring things will be vastly, vastly improved. I'm not going to deny that for a minute that things are going to be tough for our country and for our people for months to come. But we will get through it, and we will get through it well. And we will get through it well, particularly if we follow the package that we've announced today.
Point of order, Conor McGinn.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, last Monday, after speculation about Merseyside being placed into a local lockdown, I contacted ministers at the Department of Health to ask for a briefing from me and other MPs in the region. I contacted their offices directly by telephone and email every day last week and had no reply or even acknowledgement. As you will know, Mr. Speaker, on Friday, news of a lockdown in large parts of the North West was released by the government to the media and the public. Hundreds of my, and I expect your constituents, were in touch over the weekend. I still hadn't received contact of any kind from the Department of Health until I was offered a meeting yesterday, days after the announcement, which was frankly neither use nor ornament. Mr. Speaker, I realise we've suspended normal practices in this House, but I hadn't realised we'd ended established courtesies. Could you advise how I and many other honourable and right honourable members might get the government to understand that MPs want to assist in communicating the importance of these vital messages to our constituents, but if we don't know what they are, we can't?
Can I thank the honourable member for giving me notice that he wanted to raise a point of order? I think it's absolutely correct that we have to engage earlier. We shouldn't be waiting and waiting and waiting to remind ministers and their departments of responsibility of contacting members who are going to be affected. It doesn't help the department, it doesn't help the MP to actually represent their constituents. People in this House are elected to represent them, and ministers need to respond quickly when members need information. Of course, it's not a point of order for me, but I recognise that the Treasury bench, I hope, will have picked up on that, and all the other departments saying members matter, MPs are elected. I expect those response early, not at their convenience when the weekend's gone and time has followed. No further comments on the point of order. I now come to suspending the House in order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business, the safe arrival of those participating in the next. I am suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order.
Order. Order. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision for increased fines for failures to comply with the notice under Section 215 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. We are incredibly lucky as a nation to have such a vast and well-documented history. A built history is our physical connection to the past and those who came before us. We particularly feel that connection as members of this House each time we walk through the ancient Westminster Hall. Whether it is the great beams that support the roof of that hall or the narrow terraces and red brick factories of our industrial heartlands, all have equal importance. All must be protected. The law, therefore, must allow the courts the flexibility to punish those who seek to destroy our heritage. That is what I seek today through the introduction of this bill. Madam Deputy Speaker, some in our nation do not share our passion to protect and preserve our history. Rogue landlords and property owners are endangering the historic buildings we must preserve as a nation. This is a national issue, but I wish to use an example of a historic building in my own constituency of Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork to illustrate our plight. The once glorious 18th century Teapot Works, Price in Kensington, sits just outside the mother town of Burslem. The site is privately owned and has fallen into serious disrepair at great expense to the taxpayer of Stoke-on-Trent. Price in Kensington is a large complex of factory buildings situated next to the Trent and Mersey Canal and is a Grade 2 star listed building. It is of a national importance. It is the only such factory left in existence that demonstrates how the pottery industry evolved over time. Sadly, though, due to the actions of a rogue owner, most of the buildings are not safe for use. Damage is being caused by the systematic removing of slates and windows by the rogue owner, who are determined to do all he can to destroy this building, leaving them with a vacant site to sell for profit. A profit at the expense of our built heritage and of the taxpayer. The owners know that punishment for breaking the law in such a way is weak. They know they can get away with it. As well as removing structural parts of the building, the rogue owner has illegally let parts of it out to individuals under investigation for drug offences, human trafficking, and the illegal disposal of hazardous waste. The site is regularly subjected to arsonists and thieves who seek to light the flammable material the owner has placed across the site. In October 2019, the condition of the historic front range of buildings, which sat directly adjacent to a strategic road, was collapsing. Despite notices being served on the owner to carry out repairs, the council had no option but to demolish this section of the building of the site, under the Building Act of 1984, and to seek compensation from the owner by placing a charge on the land. It was either this or having the building collapse onto passing traffic. This wasn't the first time Stoke-on-Trent City Council intervened at Price in Kensington. Most notably, over the past 4 years, the council's planning and enforcement team have launched numerous actions against the owners, all at the expense of the taxpayer. This House is aware of the duties placed upon local authorities by law to protect heritage assets. However, the responsibilities that rest upon the owner, especially an uncooperative owner, are not as they ought to be. This can leave taxpayers massively out of pocket. Sections 215 and 216 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 provide legislative routes for local authorities to act against owners who do not repair their buildings. If a landlord or an owner, as in the case of Price in Kensington, refuses to adhere to Section 215 notice, then the provisions laid out in Section 216 come into force. The failure to comply with this notice is an offence that can lead to a conviction and a fine. However, and here, Madam Deputy Speaker, we arrive at the crux of the issue, the maximum fine for this offence is a level 3 on the standard scale, meaning that it is a mere £1,000. If the notice is still not complied with, then the legislation allows for a daily fine of up to £100 upon a second conviction. The local authority can, alternatively, carry out the works themselves and place a charge on the land to recover the costs. However, in areas like mine, where land values are low, as is in the case of many former industrial towns and cities, this is not a financially viable option for the council. To demonstrate this, look at the figures. The cost of repairs for Price in Kensington are estimated to be well over £5 million. The land is only valued at £70,000. Last year, magistrates at North Staffordshire Justice Centre found Middlesex-based Charles Lewis & Co guilty of failing to comply with the notice issued by the City Council. Charles Lewis & Co were handed a £1,000 fine, a £100 victim surcharge and a £530 fine on council costs. A £1,000 fine? That's not even 1% of the site value. In such situations, like the one I've just described, the local authority is essentially left with two limited but costly options. The first is an urgent works notice under Section 54 of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990. This can only apply to repairs in unoccupied sections and related to weatherproofing and keeping the building safe from collapse. If the owner takes no action, then the council must carry out the repairs and invoice the owner. This is often converted to a land charge through the courts, meaning that the council and again the taxpayer is effectively left to foot the bill, letting rich property owners and developers off the hook. The second option is to issue a repairs notice under Section 47 of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990. This notice requires the landlord or owner to carry out reasonable works to protect and preserve the building, notably if there is architectural or historical significance to the site. The council must create a detailed schedule of works, and if they are not carried out, the only option left to the council is to issue a compulsory purchase order. There are no other legal or financial penalties for non-compliance with this notice, and the works cannot be carried out in default by the council. These restrictions and meaningless punitive measures are often render local councils tied at the wrist, as the outcomes, as outlined in legislation, do very little to alleviate the finances and efforts expended during the process by the local authority. It is imperative that we increase the fines that can be levied on the owners who allow heritage negligence. Though Price in Kensington is the most damning example of this disregard in the constituency I serve, there are many other buildings in similar dilemmas across Stoke-on-Trent, from the Central Hotel in Burslem to Commerce Works in Longton. But there is not just an issue in the Potteries, it is an issue across the country. The successful passage of this bill will help hundreds of historic buildings which find themselves in a similar state to Price in Kensington. Take Burnbeck Pier in Weston-super-Mare, privately owned with an owner unwilling to cooperate. What about the Walton Works in Chesterfield, another Grade 2 star listed building falling into the ground as the private owner does nothing? The Pithead Baths at Lynmouth in Northumberland have laid vacant for over 20 years, whilst the commercial company wait for it to collapse of its own accord. Shuttleworth Hall in Burnley, a 17th century building, faces an uncertain future because the law lets the property owner off the hook. A £1,000 fine is much less than the cost of repair to these iconic and protected buildings. There are over 5,000 entries on the Heritage at Risk register. This bill will enable the relevant authorities to take action against those who destroy this nation's heritage. That is why I have the unreserved support of Historic England in my endeavour to see this law changed and our nation's heritage assets protected. Historic England agree with me that stiffer penalties are paramount to efficiency of local authorities and the security of our heritage. In addition, it was a pleasure to have the opportunity to make my case on this issue directly with the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, the Right Honourable Member for Newark. And I hope that the Government will look to include this bill in the forthcoming Planning Reform Green Paper. Madam Deputy Speaker, our silence so far on this issue has been deafening. We must act and must act now to give the courts the powers to levy unlimited fines against those who destroy this nation's built heritage. I hope I will have the full support of the House for the changes I seek today.
The question is that the Honourable Member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. If the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Chris Clarkson, Mrs Pauline Latham, Andrew Rosendale, Aaron Bell, Martin Vickers, Peter Gibson, Tim Lawton, Marco Longhi, Lee Anderson, Simon Hoare, Mr Andrew Mitchell and me, Madam.
Jonathan Gullis.
Anning, proper maintenance of land bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 29th of January 2021.
Friday the 29th of January 2021. Thank you. The clerk will now proceed the orders of the day.
United Kingdom Internal Market Bill, Committee.
No.
We now move to Committee of the Whole House. Order. Order. Before I ask the clerk to read the title of the bill, I should explain that in these exceptional circumstances, although the chair of the committee would normally sit in the clerk's chair during committee stage, in order to comply with social distancing requirements, I will remain in the speaker's chair, although I will be carrying out the role not of deputy speaker, but of chairman